Pleasure to me all at last, and welcome back to films I should have talked about years ago. And now here we come at a point in time to where the mid to late 1980s was not only revolutionizing things, including more modern car designs, rock and roll music, synthesizers, and incredible hairstyles, but it was also a time period to where movies actually started to feel different to the human eye and ear, and even anywhere else at times. It felt something different. The movie industry in 1987 alone was able to bring up a lot of interesting topics. This is actually one of those that people consider criminally underrated, in the same way that I have, in fact, talked about various other movies that have come out in the 1980s. Here we're going to talk about Project X, a film all about Air Force pilots and monkeys. Yeah, because I talked about penguins yesterday with March of the Penguins. I'd say it's about time that we follow that up properly by talking a bit about monkeys. Of course, I could get started by talking a bit about Outbreak, which stars a monkey that spreads an unknown illness to an entire city in California, but I've already done that. So, not much to talk about on that part either, so let's move on to this one. It stars the likes of Matthew Broderick, who was basically fresh off the set of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, as this came out a full year later, 1987. But the thing is, he stars as Jimmy Garrett, an Air Force pilot who had been caught stealing a plane as a way to have a date with somebody that he met. His superiors basically relegate him to a base where they're performing experiments on monkeys. Monkeys that were in fact from various parts of the world, including one in particular that was actually raised by an expert. And this expert actually taught the monkey to do a lot of things. He learned how to speak sign language with her. He learned how to properly eat an apple. He learned how to have fun and play around with sports. And he even learned how to watch TV. And a lot of other stuff that most people would get to do. But of course, what monkeys, including his own, are basically capable of doing in this situation is that this Air Force base that Garrett himself goes to are basically meant to be flying aircrafts, but not just any aircrafts. These monkeys are basically put behind the controls of actual planes, although at first they're actually supposed to be simulation programs that the monkeys themselves are trained to handle in the same way as people. And Garrett himself eventually comes across one in particular, known as Virgil. Of course, it's the same monkey who had been taught by an expert, and what Virgil does with him is that he does try to go and communicate through sign language, just like he did with his own friend and teacher. Of course, the thing about it is that Garrett and Virgil don't really come to an understanding very well, but time eventually goes by until the point where he does begin to understand what Virgil's trying to say to him, going so far as to occasionally let Virgil out of his own cage to go and visit up with friends, including his own friend known as Goliath. So Goliath basically is Virgil's friend, and Jimmy Garrett is technically the one who does a lot of stuff with him. But the main thing, the shocking part to all of this, is that the reason why the monkeys are training for a very specific pilot training program using simulation and all that stuff is simply because they eventually are taken to a room with another simulation unit, this time appearing on a large big screen, and they themselves are taught to fly very specifically while a device comes up from the floor behind them, and whatever monkey's in there gets hit with radiation. This device apparently allows the monkeys themselves to fly without falling asleep or losing control. A concentrated burst of radiation goes directly into the monkey's brain, and technically is as close to mind control as the Air Force could possibly get. Simple primitive brains mixed with radiation can possibly spell disaster. And Jimmy Garrett himself becomes appalled by this, eventually going so far as to contact the one person who eventually comes by. The same expert that supposedly sent Virgil away to a Texan zoo apparently found out that Virgil himself is now at an Air Force base where Jimmy is working at. Of course, eventually as time goes by, Garrett explains his problems to his own superiors. And they actually go as far to tell him to pack up because he should not be going around arguing or questioning his own authority like that. So, it technically is more or less the end for Jimmy himself, along with, well, the experts. So the thing is, he's technically finished. But not quite. He has himself a plan to bust the monkeys out of the complex itself by simply breaking and entering into the building itself and then taking the monkeys out of their cages. Of course, eventually troubles come down to them, and then this is where we get to see the most epic scene in the whole entire film. The ending that could definitely get your money's worth if you saw it back and then. These days, it might be a shocker, but only so far. They actually go and steal a plane. Yeah, Garrett himself was already in a lot of trouble for stealing a plane back then, but this time he does it again. This time with all the monkeys that he technically stole from the complex. And that's not enough. He eventually gets caught and put into custody. But not before the monkeys themselves actually grab a hold of the plane's controls. And that is how they eventually take off successfully. With Virgil and Goliath at the controls, they do manage to reach pretty far of a distance before eventually landing in a swamp. A swamp with a jungle that they eventually find freedom in. So these monkeys are technically fully liberated from this complex. That is what you call complete and total poach-free setups of these monkeys. So I feel like that just wraps everything up here. But first, let's talk a bit about the scoring. This movie does have itself a nicely laid out cast. For the time period, it also has some really good music. It's got itself a unique storyline, and it also does have itself something that might seem out of the ordinary, but the fact is, monkeys controlling the controls of an airplane. Don't you ever see that in anything like Curious George, for instance? Probably not so much. Unless you're willing to talk about how the fact that Curious George is a curious monkey who does things that you cannot do, no matter what. So let's just say that the scoring I give to Project X 1987 is probably only going to be at a somewhat lowly 6.8 out of 10.1. Because it only went so far during its runtime, but it at least was more worthwhile for a single viewing just so I could have the chance to talk about it fully. But in any case, this is just me talking about movies of all sorts. And with that in mind, thank you very much for watching, and be sure to like, comment, subscribe, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side if you want to see more.